They fined him $500 for a harmless garden gnome, calling it a threat to the neighborhood. HOA President Karen mocked his protests, confident in her power. But she had no idea Mark held the key to exposing her hypocrisy, and when the truth came out, it shook the entire community. Let's start from the beginning. Mark Williams, a proud veteran and father of two, cherished his cozy home in the quiet suburbs of Arizona. For him, it wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary. His neatly trimmed lawn, vibrant flowers, and a small garden gnome gifted by his daughter during Christmas reflected the warmth and love of his family. The gnome wasn't merely a decoration, it symbolized a memory, a heartfelt gift that made their house feel like a home. Little did he know that this tiny figure would become the catalyst for an unforeseen battle. One crisp morning, as Mark enjoyed the aroma of freshly brewed coffee on his porch, he noticed an official-looking envelope in his mailbox. It bore the unmistakable logo of the Homeowners Association, HOA, overseen by its stern president, Karen Price. Karen had a reputation for being a stickler for rules, often imposing her vision of perfection onto the community. Mark opened the letter, and as his eyes scanned the contents, his heart sank. The letter stated that his garden gnome violated the HOA's community standards. Moreover, it demanded the immediate removal of the gnome, threatening a $500 fine for non-compliance with neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. Mark was stunned. A harmless, cheerful gnome, how could it possibly disrupt the so-called harmony of the neighborhood? Surely, this was a misunderstanding. He reread the letter, hoping he'd misinterpreted it, but the message was clear. Can you believe this? A gnome? A threat to harmony? He thought, his disbelief quickly giving way to frustration. Determined to resolve the issue amicably, Mark decided to speak with Karen directly. Later that day, he visited the HOA office, carrying the letter and his optimism. When he finally sat across from Karen, he explained the sentimental value of the gnome, emphasizing how it was a gift from his daughter and how it caused no harm. Karen, however, remained unmoved. Her voice was cold and clipped, her expression impassive. "Rules are rules," she said matter-of-factly. "If we allow exceptions for you, the whole neighborhood standards will collapse." Mark was taken aback by her rigid stance. There was no room for dialogue or understanding in her tone. "The gnome must go," she concluded, dismissing him as though the matter was already settled. As Mark walked back home, a mix of anger and disbelief swirled in his mind. How could someone be so inflexible and dismissive over something so trivial? This was his property, his family's safe haven. Why should anyone else dictate what he could or couldn't display? That letter and Karen's unyielding attitude were just the beginning, a sign that the HOA's authority might have overstepped its bounds. Mark knew he was facing more than just a dispute over a garden gnome. This was a fight for his rights, and he wasn't going to back down. Mark refused to back down. That little garden gnome wasn't just a decoration. It was a piece of his family's story, a token of love from his daughter. Removing it felt like giving up a part of what made their home special. But defiance came at a price. Not long after his decision, Mark received another letter from the HOA. This time, it wasn't just a warning. The letter informed him of a formal $500 fine with a chilling ultimatum. If the gnome wasn't removed immediately, the fine would increase. The escalation left Mark both frustrated and defiant. How could something so innocent cause such a storm? Yet, the situation was about to get worse. Karen Price, the HOA president, didn't stop at sending letters. She began spreading rumors throughout the neighborhood, whispering to anyone who would listen that Mark was deliberately stirring up trouble, disrespecting community values, and even trying to divide the neighborhood. The lies were subtle, yet effective, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of those who once supported him. The change was palpable. Neighbors who used to wave as they walked by now avoided eye contact. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt stilted, hesitant. Mark noticed some neighbors looking at his house with what seemed like a mix of curiosity and judgment. It was as if Karen's words had turned his quiet life into a sideshow. And it wasn't just the rumors. Mark learned that Karen was using HOA's authority to intimidate others. A few of his neighbors confided in him, explaining that they were warned about potential fines for minor infractions like lawn height or holiday decorations. It was clear Karen was using fear to isolate him. Determined to take a stand, Mark tried to rally his community. He invited his neighbors to a gathering at his home to discuss the growing overreach of the HOA. But before the meeting could take place, Karen struck again. She sent a formal notice declaring that any unofficial community meetings were prohibited without HOA approval, effectively shutting down his efforts to organize. It was a calculated move to suppress dissent, leaving Mark feeling cornered. As the days went on, Mark began to notice strange occurrences. One evening, he spotted a new security camera mounted near his property. Its angle seemed suspiciously directed toward his yard. The HOA had never mentioned adding cameras, and no one had asked for his consent. Then, the guest parking spaces near his home, which his family often used, were suddenly marked as restricted zones. The signs went up overnight, with no explanation. The surveillance, the parking restrictions, the rumors, it all pointed to something larger. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was hiding something. Her actions seemed too deliberate, too personal. What was she trying to protect, or worse, cover up? One thing was certain. This was no longer about a garden gnome. It was about power, control, and the lengths some people would go to enforce it. Mark knew he had to dig deeper, not just for himself, but for the entire community. Mark knew he couldn't let Karen's overreach go unchecked. Her tactics weren't just unreasonable, they were invasive, manipulative, and likely hiding something bigger. Fueled by a sense of justice and the need to protect his family's peace, Mark began his own investigation. He started by poring over the HOA bylaws, a dense and convoluted document that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. As he sifted through pages of regulations and provisions, he began to notice inconsistencies, vague phrasing and rules that seemed to contradict one another. It was as if the rules were intentionally crafted to give the HOA unchecked power, but Mark didn't stop there. He reached out to neighbors who had quietly supported him before Karen's intimidation tactics took hold. What he discovered was both shocking and validating. Several of them shared their own stories of unjust fines for supposed infractions, fences that were too tall, mailboxes that weren't uniform, and even flower beds that were too bright. The fines were relentless, and most residents paid them out of fear of escalating conflict. One neighbor confided that Karen had even threatened to take legal action against them for questioning her authority. As Mark connected the dots, a troubling pattern emerged. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, it was exploiting them. And the money collected from fines? It wasn't being used for community improvements as Karen often claimed during HOA meetings. Instead, Mark found out that financial reports were either heavily redacted or completely inaccessible to residents. What was she hiding? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Mark installed security cameras around his property, not just to protect his home, but also to monitor any unusual activity. Late one night, as he reviewed the footage, he froze at what he saw. There, in the dim glow of her porch light, was Karen herself. She was setting up decorative lanterns around her yard, ornate, brightly colored fixtures that clearly violated the same aesthetic standards she used to find Mark for his garden gnome. The hypocrisy was glaring. Mark's discovery of Karen's double standards felt like the turning point he needed. If she was willing to break her own rules so brazenly, what else was she hiding? And more importantly, how could he expose her actions to the rest of the community? The next day, Mark met with a lawyer, presenting everything he had uncovered: the unjust fines, the hidden financial records, and the footage of Karen's blatant disregard for the rules she enforced. The lawyer was astounded by the evidence and agreed to help Mark build a case. But Mark didn't stop there. He also reached out to the few remaining neighbors who weren't afraid to stand up to Karen's intimidation. Together, they began organizing a collective effort to expose the HOA's misuse of power. Word spread quickly. Mark's neighbors, emboldened by his determination, started sharing their own experiences publicly. Stories of unfair treatment, unexplained financial charges, and arbitrary rule enforcement painted a picture of an HOA that had lost sight of its purpose. It wasn't long before the momentum grew into a full-fledged campaign to hold Karen accountable. Mark knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about a garden gnome anymore. It was about standing up to corruption, protecting his community, and showing that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person could make a difference. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and Mark stood at the entrance of the community hall, clutching a folder brimming with evidence. The room was filled with murmurs of anticipation as neighbors took their seats. Many of them looked uncertain, torn between their frustration with the HOA and the fear of repercussions from Karen. The air was thick with tension, and every creak of a chair seemed amplified in the silence that fell when Mark stepped forward. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but firm. "I know many of you have questions about how our HOA operates, and I believe it's time for some answers." He placed a small USB drive into the projector and began displaying the evidence he had painstakingly gathered. First came the financial reports, or rather the parts Karen had tried to hide. Highlighting discrepancies, Mark explained how fines collected from residents were funneled into purchases that had no apparent benefit for the community. Then, with a click, he showed a video clip from his security camera. The room gasped as Karen appeared on screen, decorating her yard with ornate lanterns. Blatant violations of the same rules she used to penalize others. The room erupted. Neighbors whispered heatedly among themselves, their voices rising into a wave of indignation. Karen, seated at the front, attempted to maintain her composure, but her clenched fists and flushed face betrayed her growing unease. "These are temporary," she stammered, standing to address the crowd. "They were part of a test for potential neighborhood upgrades." Her excuse fell flat. The incredulous stares from the audience made it clear no one believed her. Mark didn't let up. Upgrades? Using funds that were meant for community repairs without a single vote or notice to the residents? How is that justified? At that moment, Mark's lawyers stood. "We've reviewed the HOA's financial records and found serious irregularities. We've also noted a consistent pattern of unilateral decisions made by the HOA president, bypassing the bylaws that require member approval. This goes beyond mere oversight. It's a misuse of authority." Karen's face paled as murmurs turned into outright accusations. "How much money has she taken?" one neighbor shouted. "What else has she been hiding?" demanded another. The room had shifted. The community, once divided by fear and manipulation, now stood united in outrage. But the final blow came when Mark revealed that he had contacted local authorities. Representatives from the police and an independent auditor were already investigating the HOA's finances. "This isn't just about rules or aesthetics anymore," Mark said, his voice resonating through the room. "This is about trust, and Karen has betrayed that trust." Karen attempted a last-ditch effort to defend herself, but her voice was drowned out by the collective outrage of the residents. Calls for her resignation echoed through the hall. She had no choice but to step down. In the weeks that followed, Karen was fined heavily for her actions and ordered to repay the funds she had misused. The HOA board was restructured, with new members elected to ensure transparency and fairness. Mark's efforts inspired the entire community to demand reforms, instituting measures that would prevent such abuses from ever happening again. As for Mark, he stood on his porch one quiet evening, looking at the garden gnome that started it all. It stood proudly, a symbol not just of his family's love, but of the power of persistence and standing up for what's right. His neighbors, once wary and distant, now greeted him warmly, grateful for his courage and determination. Mark had won more than just a personal victory. He had restored integrity to his community, and for the first time in months, the air felt lighter, the neighborhood truly at peace. The garden gnome stood proudly on Mark's porch, untouched and unbothered, basking in the warm glow of the morning sun. It wasn't just a decorative piece anymore. It had become a symbol of resilience, justice, and the strength of standing up for what's right. Neighbors passing by would smile and wave at Mark, their expressions filled with gratitude and newfound respect. The once divided community had come together, realizing that their unity held more power than the intimidation they had endured. Mark's life had transformed in ways he couldn't have imagined. Where once he felt isolated and targeted, he now found himself surrounded by neighbors who saw him as a hero. People stopped by to thank him, sharing their own stories of relief and encouragement. Many admitted they had been too afraid to speak out before, but were inspired by Mark's courage to take a stand. At a community gathering organized to celebrate the changes within the HOA, Mark was invited to speak, Standing before a crowd that now felt like a family, he spoke from the heart. This fight wasn't just about a garden gnome, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. It was about something much bigger. It was about our rights, our dignity, and the kind of community we want to live in. The audience listened intently, nodding in agreement. Even the simplest person, Mark continued, can win a battle against injustice. You don't need power or influence, just the will to do what's right. And most importantly, we must never forget the strength we have when we stand together. His words were met with thunderous applause. Neighbors embraced one another, feeling a renewed sense of solidarity. For too long, they had let fear and manipulation dictate their lives, but now they were determined to never let it happen again. Mark's story was proof that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The reforms within the HOA were just the beginning. New rules ensured transparency, regular community votes, and accountability for all decisions. The days of unchecked authority were over. Karen's fall from power had not only restored fairness, but also reminded everyone that no one was above the law. As the gathering dispersed, Mark stood by his porch, watching as families walked home with a sense of optimism in their step. He glanced at the gnome and smiled. It had been such a small thing, but his presence now carried immense meaning. It was a reminder of the struggle, the victories, and the friendships that had formed along the way. For Mark, this chapter of his life was more than just a personal triumph. It was a legacy. He had shown his children, his neighbors, and even himself that standing up for what's right was always worth the fight. The gnome, small and unassuming, had sparked something powerful. And as the neighborhood basked in the peace they had reclaimed, it was clear, together, they had torn down the facade of control and built something far more valuable: trust and community.